Hello, my name is Steve Adolf, and welcome to our topic, Epic User Stories, or Don't Be Afraid of the Big Story. So, what do we mean by the big story? Well, if you recall from our previous topics, we said that a user story is something that delivers or describes an end to end valuable slice of the system that can be delivered to a stakeholder or user within a single sprint or iteration. The intent there, right, is to be able to evaluate the product that was delivered, get feedback, and be able to quickly pivot such that we can keep ourselves moving more towards the valuable green and less towards the wasteful red. Now, the question, of course, is what happens when we encounter a story that's far too big? In other words, it's not something that we can deliver in a single sprint or iteration. And these do exist. So if you take a look at a backlog, we can say that the backlog consists of a number of backlog items. And those backlog items can be, as we said, a user story, but we can introduce this idea of an epic story. And the epic story is simply the big story. But in our world, an epic story is something that is either can be broken down or decomposed into smaller stories, child stories, or smaller epic stories. Now, for those of you who are not hip on UML here, I can give you a better example of what an epic is. So, for example, we have here a really big epic. So this is a story that describes an end-to-end valuable behavior to a stakeholder of the system, but we discover that no, we can't. This is too big to implement in a single sprint or iteration. So we can actually elaborate that into a number of child stories or smaller child epics. And each of those epics or child epics can in themselves be broken down. So you can see that there is this hierarchical parent to child relationship between stories. So we have epics, which are simply big stories, and they represent the term epic represents a story that is too big to fit into a single sprint or iteration and can be broken down into two or more child stories or child epics, if you like. And you can see that we can go through parent, grandparent, etc., generations of this. So this is the idea that we can have a really big story, but we're able to split it such that we can get smaller epic stories or smaller stories, which we can then implement in a single sprint. So to give you an idea of what the story splitting may look like, here we have a story that, as a hungry person, I want to eat a toaster such that I can eat fresh toast. And so you see our story there. It's too big. We can't implement that. We can't build a whole toaster within our 2-week iteration or sprint. But we can then split that into much smaller stories and that are possible to implement in a single iteration or sprint. And if those cannot be implemented in a single sprint or iteration, we can split them even further. Now, one of the fun things about being able to split a story into smaller parts, each of which is valuable on its own and can be delivered to a stakeholder for evaluation, is we can start looking through these stories themselves and say, well, are all of these stories valuable? Clearly, the idea here that we can toast bagels is probably valuable, and that the toaster looks good is valuable, so those might get prioritized. But this story here about, as a Trekkie, having the warp nacelles, maybe that's a little less valuable, and that its implementation can be deferred. So this is the idea of being able to take a big story, which we'll call an epic, and be able to split it into smaller stories. Maybe these stories are epics on their own, and we'll have to continue splitting them into smaller and smaller epics until we get to something that, yes, we can definitely implement this in a single sprint. Now you may be asking, well, how do I split these? What criteria do I use to split these? That is a question for another topic. There's also one more other point that I want to make here. The term epic is used to mean many, many different things. Just as the term story tends to have many different meanings depending on your context or which methodology you're using, unfortunately, epic tends to have a wide variety of different meanings. In our context here, I'm using the generic definition of an epic. It is simply a large story that can be broken, that cannot be implemented in a single iteration or sprint, that we need to be able to break it down into smaller epics or into smaller stories, the smaller stories that we can implement in a single sprint.